thank you for joining us at the ever-improving No Soundbites Allowed podcast. My name is Michael Vasquez. We thank you for joining us in this adventure of describing the politics that go on in our nation on a personal and local level as often as possible, giving you, the audience, more than just 30 seconds to understand what's going on in our nation. We look forward to joining you as we go. Just sit back, enjoy the ride. Please remember, if you like the episodes, like it, share it, let other people know, and if you can, please donate, even if it's $2, even if it's $5, because it all makes a difference. We thank you, and here we go. Hello, everybody, and thank you for joining us. That's right, this is No Soundbites Allowed, with your host, Michael Voss, the Dragon of the Southern Tier, and I'm going to have some fun today. And it's going to be a fun conversation because we're going to be talking about knives in the United Kingdom, England, and we're going to be talking about the United States and guns and gun control. And let's really get a handle on what we're talking about here. Because I know there's a lot of people out there who have been pointing to all the various incidents that tend to go on in this nation. They talk about gun violence and they talk about it's a type of weapons, whether it's an AR-15 or the quote unquote assault firearm, that they like to say and misquote because that's not true. An assault weapon is a fully automatic firearm, which is not legal. So that's just silly. And that was since the National Firearm Act of 1934. So that's just not a reality. But they've misnamed it, and they've been doing that since 1985 from California. That's where the term comes from, and that's why it's used so often, because it gives a very clear misunderstanding of firearms. Because we're talking about semi-automatic rifles, no different than hunting rifles. And many people have been complaining, though, saying, hey, firearms, they're just bad. They're just bad. Oh, my God, you have to get rid of all of them. And they've been making a bigger and bigger push. We even seen a former United States Supreme Court justice come out and recently say that he wants to repeal the Second Amendment. And yet I hear all these people who say, well, no, it's not really about taking away your guns, except it is about taking away the guns. Because at the end of the day, that's exactly what happens. You're stopping me from being able to own a firearm. And you're preventing me to be able to live out my Second Amendment rights. So let's really talk about this. And especially since we're talking about 18 to 21-year-olds being denied their rights because they're legal adults. They can go out and vote. But some are saying that, well, you can't trust 18 to 21-year-olds. They can't have a firearm. And this is to make people safer. I always hear that. All of these changes are because they want to make people safer. Except that's an illusion. It's an illusion not only because, as we saw in last week in Maryland, that a 17-year-old who is not legally able to have a handgun, he got a handgun. So he broke the law first because he got a handgun and he's not allowed to have that. Second, he broke the law because he took that handgun into a school, which is a gun-free zone. So he broke the law there. And then he killed someone and attempted to kill other individuals, which is, murder and attempted murder. Those are illegal as well, before he finally took his own life after he had been confronted by a school resource officer, a police officer in the school that was immediately on scene to try and protect lives. You didn't see a lot of news about that because this is the truth, that it takes a good person with a firearm to try and combat a bad person with a firearm. And the fact that in the state of Maryland, it wasn't legal for him to be able to have the handgun, that it wasn't legal for him to have a handgun in a school gun-free zone, and it wasn't legal for him to commit murder and attempt murder, had nothing to do with the fact that these things all happened. So when people tell you you're going to be safer if you lose your right to have a firearm, and if someone restricts your right to have a firearm or restricts your ability to live out and have your constitutional rights, well, they're lying to you. It's an illusion of safety. It makes it sound like you'll be safer. But I want to take this into an entirely different direction. Let's go with the Second Amendment haters. That's right, these anti-amendment individuals who want to remove it. They say we should be more like other countries. So I decided, and looking at news today, and it just made me think, let's actually consider what would happen. What about England, which is a very similar country to us? England has huge restrictions on firearms. They don't have a constitution. They don't have a constitutional right to firearms like we do here. They don't have all the freedoms that we have here, but they are similar. We came from a similar background, similar type of law structure, obviously a different government type, as they're a monarchy and we're not, and we're a constitutional government and they're a parliamentary government. But given those differences, we have similar traditions, we have similar culture, we have similar just about everything, even a similar language. So they probably are one of the best corollaries to us, because we came from England as a nation and we're so connected on so many other levels. Whereas if you're talking about Japan, Russia, Venezuela, anywhere else in the world, we're not the same. They're not the same kind of people. They don't think the same way. They don't have the same culture and same biases or belief systems that we do here. So let's actually look at someone who's like us, because no one wants to talk about that. They talk about Scandinavia. We're not a Scandinavian nation. We didn't have monarchies. We're not mountainous, a nation bounded by mountains and so many other differences that are completely different. So that's not a fair comparison. So let's forget about that. Let's actually look at someone who's really like us, which would be England, the United Kingdom. And in the United Kingdom, I was doing a little bit of research on this for you before I got here. They have almost entirely had no firearms. And that's because there was a attempted assassination on one of the kings, one of the monarchs. And so they prohibited firearms. But in 1715, they've gone back and forth prior to that. And they had, in the 1500s, they restricted everyone except for Protestants. And then they made some changes so that everyone could have firearms, and they took them all away. And in 1715, they essentially made a ban on firearms, which was then modified in 1903 to include pistols. And that would also eventually, so that's all revolver type firearms. In 1968, they updated their firearm laws to add in further restrictions, taking into account the changes of firearms. And then in 1988, they put in the most recent and current addition and modification to their gun restriction laws. So they have a culture in England that they do not have firearms. The general masses are highly restricted. You can have a shotgun. You can have certain types of rifles, which are rimfire rifles, not like our hunting rifles, which are center fire. So that's completely restricted. Handguns are almost impossible to get in the nation because they are wholesale restricted. So it's very, very few people actually have access to any type of firearms. And most firearms are shotguns or bolt action, rimfire types of rifles. And with all of that, so that's everything that you hear most people who want to repeal the Second Amendment or ban all firearms. This is what they want. You can't have a handgun. You get a shotgun for home defense. Maybe you can have a hunting rifle, and no one else gets to have firearms. That's it. You just don't get any firearms. And you know what? It didn't work, because the reason why they had the 1988 law is because in 1987, the first mass murder since 1980 occurred in England. And there were two others, the most recent one being in 2010. And in 2010, that individual, a taxi driver, he went out and he killed 12 people, injured another 11 people as well. He was using a shotgun and a bolt-action rifle. He didn't have a handgun. He didn't have an assault weapon. as it's being defined now by many Democrats and many liberals. So it wasn't a repeating rifle, didn't have a magazine. This is a bolt action rifle and a shotgun, which they don't talk about very much. But those were the weapons that he used, and he went out and he killed 12 people and injured another 11. So before I even go further, we've already found a flaw with this, which is that even if you're restricting the law and you limit it you see the Second Amendment in a way that was never created and restrict everyone in the nation to only having a firearm to go hunting and to protect their home, and you still will not ensure that everyone will be safe from some maniac, some madman, some deranged criminal who goes out there and decides they want to kill people, because it happened in England, a country that has a culture of gun restrictions forever. So you're not going to be safe. But let's really look into this, because there's another component to this. And in fact, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a break here really quick, because I want to go into what we're really seeing happening there. While there are no firearms, let's not kid ourselves. England has homicides. They have a lot of homicides. And even though they're not having a high rate of homicides due to illegal gun use, although they still do, about 5,000 plus per year. So criminals are still getting firearms, and they still use firearms to commit murder, but it is not nearly the numbers that we see here in the United States. And I should give a caveat. In the United States, when you hear people talk about gun deaths and gun violence, they most often quote the total number of individuals who die in a homicide by a firearm. What they don't tell you is that 61%, on average, 61% of all homicides with a firearm in the United States are suicides. That's a big thing. Most of them are suicides. 2/3, almost, on average, almost 2/3 every year are suicides. So when you take that into account, now you're talking about far, far less. So as an example, and some of the examples I'm going to be using in this discussion is we're looking at in 2015, there were 36,161 traffic deaths. Wrong number. I was looking at the wrong number. In 2016, 11,004 people were murdered with a firearm. I'm looking at my own notes. I'm trying to get the numbers right here so that we can tell you. And, well, there's a bunch of numbers. Let me take a break. Let me come right back. And then we'll really get into this and really get into all the numbers so that I can do this justice. Because I think it's really important to talk about what happens if you take away the Second Amendment. Will people be safer? Will people become safer if you couldn't have a firearm? And I'm going to answer that for you. And we'll be right back. Whoops. Wrong one. Sometimes. Here we go. All right, everyone. Thank you for coming back to No Soundbites Allowed with your host, Michael Voss, the Dragon of the Southern Tier, as we're going to be talking about a very interesting subject. So, as I mentioned, my proposal is let's look at what what is the possibility of the landscape of the reality if the United States suddenly lost the Second Amendment, if we took on, as some of these opponents of the Second Amendment try to say, let's limit the freedom to own a firearm. Let's take out that constitutional right and become more like other countries in the world. And in particular, I'm using the example of England, our closest equivalent nation in terms of culture, in terms of language, usage, everything, law, everything. So they would be our closest analog. And so I wanted to look at it. So in the first segment, we were talking about the history of England not having firearms. That is what they tend to have. And so then that brings up the question, and I'll get into the numbers I left off in the last segment with in a moment, but that leaves us with, what do they have? What is going on there? Because is England safer? Is it safe to be in England? Since they don't have firearms, they don't have murders, right? Homicides should be down, right? Well, no, not quite. Because if you look at violence in the UK, there were exactly, in 2017, there were 37,443, that's right, 37,443 knife crimes in the country of England, the United Kingdom. That's huge. And 90% of them were assaults and or robberies. So 50% of them were for assaults. So that's a huge number. And I want to give a comparison, and that's part of what I was working out for you just before. In 2015, according to the CDC, there were 36,252 homicides with a firearm, and 23,273 of them were suicides. Throw them out the window. So we're not going to talk about the suicides. So that means there were, in fact, in 2015, according to the CDC, 12,979 firearm homicides. Let's consider that for a second. Okay? 12,979 firearm homicides. These are, and looking against 37,443 knife crimes. That is huge. That is a huge difference. We're talking about roughly 3 times as many knife crimes versus the United States. And by the way, if you really want to figure this out, you're talking about in the United States, in 2015, there were 36,161 traffic deaths. So as many people, including more people, or just about as many people, died because of a traffic incident, a traffic accident, as did all firearms. But we don't ban certain types of cars. By the way, just so you really understand this, 57,567 people died because of poisoning. Not suicide, poisoning. 57,567 in 2015. There were only 12,979 firearms, but I don't see a ban or a special license to get rat poison. But let's look at England again. So, in 2016, 39% of homicides were due to knives. 77% of all violent crime didn't even need a weapon. It was just by someone's hands or their fist kicking or fighting. And 20% of the knife crimes that are committed in the UK are by kids who are under 18. That's 20%. 20%. How many mass shootings were there with someone under 18? 4? 4? 5? In the last 20 years? At least, and actually more in the last 40 years. That's it. But yet we're looking at, in people saying, oh, well, no, if you get rid of the Second Amendment, you'll make things safer. People will be safe because the guns will be gone. And so everyone will be nice and kind. Except it's so bad that because of 2017, a stabbing of a young girl, we see that in England, they now want to ban knives. It was a 13-year-old girl who was stabbed to death, and they want to get rid of knives now because they think knives are the problem, that inanimate object is the cause and the problem. And if they can just get rid of the knives, they can remove 37,443 crimes. Except that's not the case. Because that's the same exact argument being used here in the United States about firearms. If you just get rid of the firearms, people will be safer. And no one will have to worry about it. Really? And they love to point out the rifles. Well, let's look at the rifles, the firearms, the assault weapons. Because in 2015, again, according to the CDC, we're talking about 3.3%, 374 homicides were by rifle. 374, or 3.3% of all of the homicides. And you'll be shocked by this, but 64% of all homicides were by handgun. Really? Handguns. 64%. And on average, it's usually somewhere around 60%, plus minus on any given year. About 60% of all homicides happen with a handgun, not a rifle. That includes years where there is a mass shooting. It's still 60% by handguns. So we're listening to all of these politicians say, we're going to make you safer because we're going to get rid of those evil assault weapons, which are rifles, semi-automatic rifles, hunting rifles. Well, they're lying to you because 60 to 64% of all homicides happen with handguns. So if you removed all the rifles in 2016, as an example, you'd have 374 people. God bless them, they would be still alive. And that is an important number. But at the same time, there would be roughly 12,600 people who still would have died. Because the rifles aren't the problem. People aren't dying because of rifles. More people died with shotguns. More people in the United States died because of knife attacks in that same year. In that same exact year, and I have it in front of me. Hang on. I want to bring that up. In that same year, 2016, where there were 374 rifles used to commit a homicide, there were 262 shotguns that year. But most importantly, there were 1,604 people who were killed with a knife. 1,604. Knives are more deadly than rifles are. By the way, just so you know, just using your hands and feet, well, that's also more deadly than using a rifle because 656 people in 2016 were killed that way. And hammers, well, they're more deadly too. 472 people died because of hammers and other clubs and baseball bats, other blunt weapons, versus the 374 for rifles. So you have to put this into context. How is this making people safer? You're still going to have baseballs. You're going to still have hammers. You're going to still have forks. You're going to have steak knives and all other types of knives. And let's look back. When we look at England, are people becoming safer? And the answer is no. Now, I know a big thing people are saying, well, you got to think about it. How safe are people with the knives? I mean, knives aren't that deadly. How bad could it be? Well, it's actually pretty bad. And when I consider it, and I wanted to look at something in the numbers when I went through it, and I said to myself, well, you know, we're taking out 60 to 64% of all of the individuals, 61% on average, of all the gun homicides, firearm homicides in the United States because of suicide. And I wondered, well, how many people committed suicide with a knife? And when I was looking up the data in 2016 from the UK, the answer is I couldn't find an answer. At the very least, it has to be less than 4% of all suicides. There were about 5,965 suicides in 2016 in the UK. And I know that at least 4% of them were by drowning. And at least less than 4% of all the people in the UK who committed suicide used a knife because it wasn't listed in the data coming from the actual, in the UK, it's called the Office of National Statistics. That's for the UK. It's kind of like our Bureau of Labor and Statistics or the DOJ. They have the Office of National Statistics. Knife suicides don't count. So every single person who dies because of a knife and all of the knife crimes, and none of those numbers are reduced because of suicide. So these are the actual numbers of what you get. And remember, England is way smaller than the United States, so you would multiply these numbers because knives would still be available. So you're going to be increasing these numbers by 2 or 3 times. So you're talking about 70, 100,000 knife crimes in the United States if we were to be comparable. That's huge. That's not safe. And people say, well, you can't kill that many people, except, yes, you can. There are killing sprees going on. In fact, at the moment, according to the BBC, we see that knife crimes are up 21%. They're increasing. And we see that in London alone, there is a rise in crime that is at all-time levels. This is huge. They're having some of the highest levels. And in fact, they expect that in London, the number of stabbings, murders by stabbing, are going to put them, or currently have them, at more than in New York City. There are more people who died because of knives in London than the total number of people who died by a firearm in New York City. That's just reported today. That's insane. That's horrible. But remember, it's the firearms that are going to make you die. It's the dangerous thing because firearms are deadly. It's guns, the Second Amendment. And if you could just get rid of that, just like it is in London, well, then you would have more people dead than in New York. Since the beginning of 2018, there are more people dead because of stabbings. Tell me how not having a firearm, as it's illegal in London, you can't have a handgun. Shotguns are very limited, and rifles, basically bolt action. It's highly regulated, highly restricted. They don't even have that right as part of their government, their parliamentary system. It's not a given right of theirs. That's a right given by the king and their parliament, and they don't have that right. And yet, they have knife attacks rampant, running up 21%. That more people are dying in London than in New York, and they don't have firearms. You gotta wonder. It goes back to something that I always like to say, and most people agree and understand. Crazy people, criminals, are not deterred by the law. It does not affect them. They break the law consciously. That's why they're called criminals. They look to kill people because they are deranged. And the fact that you've denied them one weapon, just like they did in England, doesn't stop them. They continue to have these homicides. It doesn't make a difference. So that's kind of terrifying. But we're going to take another break, and then I'm going to come back and we'll talk about it a little bit more. And thank you for coming back to No Soundbites Allowed, the only program, only podcast in the Southern Tier where we get to talk about the issues that affect you and really talk about the issues that are going on. And that's one of the things that we're doing right now. We're talking about the Second Amendment. We're talking about the idea that's coming from Governor Cuomo, many Democrats, many progressives, not only in New York State, but across the United States, that are saying that you're going to be safer because we can get rid of the Second Amendment, that we can limit the firearms that you can have, that we can take your Second Amendment right and alter it, if not remove it completely. And they're telling you you're going to be safer, that you're going to be somehow protected, and that all of the bad people are going to stop being bad people, and they won't die, they won't be killed. And that's just not true, because we're looking at England, our closest analog. The nation that we are most similar to is England. And in England, they are running rampant with knife attacks. So much so that England is taking a page from America and looking to ban knives. So the very thing that we're talking about in America, let's get rid of the firearms. In a nation that has been removed firearms for about 300 years. So it's not a new thing. Their culture is not to have firearms. 300 years of laws and restrictions and extreme penalties for having a firearm. And instead, they have as much, if not more, of a problem with knives than we have with firearms. That's something pretty impressive to think about. So when someone tells you, you're just going to be safer because you can't have knife attacks that would have multiple injuries. Well, that's one of the last things I want to address here. Because according to the Smithsonian.com, an article that they did, and this article was in 2014, so it's not even up to date, but we've seen that there are attacks in China, according to the article, almost on a daily basis. And we see that in Japan in 2001, a janitor went out and killed 8 children. A man in Tokyo went on a random stabbing spree with a dagger in 2008. He killed 4 people. In South Korea, a disgruntled man killed 8 people in a stabbing spree, and that was in 2008. And in Germany, a drunk 16-year-old, stabbed 41 people at a Berlin train station. And in 2013, we see that the 13-year-old girl was stabbed to death in the UK, which caused them to say they got to get rid of the knives. So we're looking at lots of countries around the world, and we're looking at the fact that well over 32 countries have, and matter of fact, again, according to the Smithsonian.com article from 2013, they're talking about 36% of murders are with knives, and that's across 32 countries in Europe. 36% of murders are with knives in 32 countries in Europe. So does that mean you're suddenly going to become safer? No. Does that mean that someone can't do a mass killing? Yes, they can. Yes, they can. Still, absolutely, as much as ever before. Will it be as fast? Maybe, maybe not. But you know what? You can still kill many people. And the problem isn't that. And, there's no comparison, of course. Every one life saved is an important thing, and we want to save as many lives as possible. But the fact is that you're being given a promise that's false, a false sense of security. Because the message that's out there on the internet from Parkland, from David Hogue, from progressives and liberals and many Democrats is, if you just get rid of the Second Amendment, everything will be okay. You'll sleep well at night. You're going to be safe. Matter of fact, that's why Governor Cuomo created overnight the New York SAFE Act. And he restricted all kinds of firearms, and that's why they have the assault weapons ban of 2018, H.R. 5087, where they're looking to restrict hundreds of types of firearms. And we have a Supreme Court justice coming out and saying, a former Supreme Court justice coming out and saying that he wants to repeal the Second Amendment. They want to take this away from you so that you can be safer. Except we see in England, in 32 countries in Europe, in China, in Japan, you're not. It doesn't mean that you're not going to see homicides. It doesn't mean that crazy people aren't going to act crazily. It's not that criminals won't continue to break the law. And when we see in a country where for 300 years, where they never had the right to bear arms, and they were completely restricted, and it's restricted down to just sporting, so hunting and sporting, even there, you still see individuals go out as they did in 2010, and have a mass shooting. And you still have on top of that a massive increase in the number of knife attacks, with 36% of all murders being done by knives. Oh, and 43% still by firearms, because guess what? The criminals don't follow the law. 43% of the murders in 32 European countries are still done by firearm. So does that make you safer in any way, shape, or form? How is anyone going to be safer? You won't. It's an illusion. The only thing that's being traded off here is you, the individual person, will be less free than you were the day before. You will have less freedom in your life, and you're going to have a stronger government. Matter of fact, let's look at what happened in Parkland. David Hogue went out and he said, I want a stronger government to protect me. The government has to do more to protect me. Why isn't the government doing that? So he got that. They have helicopters flying over at the beginning of school, at the end of school, according to David Hogue. According to David Hogue, they have officers patrolling in their classroom halls. And he says, and some of the other Parkland, Florida survivors are saying that the school's like a prison now. Well, isn't that what you asked for? You gave up your freedom. You asked the government to have more power, and to take away your freedom and your privacy, like having backpacks that are clear instead of concealed, or a regular backpack for that matter. You're giving up your freedoms, and the government got more power. And now you live in what he is comparing to a police state. That is what the answer is. That's what you get. When you lose freedom and give it to the government takes that power and you don't get it back. The government uses that power and becomes authoritative. Mr. Hogue himself said in C-SPAN and on other news media that he believes he's living in a police state now. Well, what do you expect? You just gave up your freedom. If we give up the Second Amendment, we will become more like England, which means that we will have knife attacks that will go up exponentially. Criminals will still continue to use firearms as they do in 32 European nations. People will still be murdered. Homicides will not stop. There will be a different mix of knives versus handguns, the two most prevalent ways that people are murdered in the United States. And we will become more like Europe in that mixture, but people won't be safer. No one will be safer. Kids, if anything, we see in England, 1 in 5 of the people who are convicted of having an illegal weapon, which is a knife, are under the age of 18. What we will see is more individuals with more access to a weapon, a steak knife, any kind of knife, and they'll use that because criminals and the deranged are not deterred by laws or rights. They're deterred by good people. And whether that's a Samaritan, as we saw in Texas, at the Texas church shooting or attempted shooting, whether that's a police officer, like we saw in Maryland with the school resource officer. These are cases where we see good people defending other Americans, and they are effective. That's the most effective thing. Good people who are well trained and dedicated to their communities, protecting the people in their communities. That deters and stops violence. That deters and stops crazy. But what we don't see, as we saw in Oakland, and what we saw in in Florida and Orlando, and what we've seen here, even here where I live in Binghamton, we see that when you don't have those protections, when you don't have those individuals there and available to be able to defend others, well, what you get are mass shootings and crime and violence, like Chicago. Because they have lots of laws in Chicago, just like they did in Maryland. And it doesn't stop people from being killed. Let's take away the illusion. Let's take away this lie that's being fed to people. Because if we become more like Europe, if we become more like our closest ally and our best analog as a nation, we become more like England, people are not going to suddenly be safe. We're not going to see everyone running around like hippies in flower power and communes or whatever the imaginings of these individuals who want to get rid of all firearms think will happen. Because we live in a real world. And it's great to have that dream. It's great to have that illusion. But the fact is that illusion doesn't equal protection. That doesn't equal safety. It's a nice ideal. I love the ideal. I wish that it could be possible. But we live in a real world. And criminals and the deranged don't care. So if nothing else, let's take this example of what England is and what that presents to us. Because if we continue down the road we're on right now, that is our reality. That we're going to continue to have people murdered. About 36% of them will be because of knife crimes. And what we're going to see is another 40% are going to continue to be killed because of firearms, which will be illegal. And occasionally there'll still be a mass shooting with illegal firearms. Because that isn't going to, by taking away your freedom, it's not going to make you safe. It's not going to suddenly change anything. You're still going to be in the same exact boat with the same exact situation, except you're going to be less capable of being able to take care of yourself. And you're going to be that much more reliant on the government taking care of you instead. And every time, in every nation, throughout history, the more power that government gets, the less free the people become, and eventually more authoritative that government becomes until it becomes totalitarian. And that has never worked out well for any nation on the face of the earth since the beginning of recorded time. That's just the reality. But it's a lot to consider, and I look forward to hearing other people's points of view. Please give me the other points of view that are out there. I'd love to have this conversation, and I look forward to it. And with that, I'll let you go. I hope everyone has a very safe day. We look forward to speaking with you soon, and I wish you the best, and we'll be back at No Soundbites Allowed in the near future. Thank you.